Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
They brought out a scoop of tiramisu the size of a baseball, planted a sparkler in it, and called it festive. My new title, Director of Operations, was written across the plate in melting chocolate syrup that was already pooling like a crime scene. My boss, Mark, raised his glass. My team clapped in that loud, relieved way people do when they want to look supportive but are really checking the time. Then my father leaned back, laced his fingers over his chest like he was presiding over a trial, and said with a half-smile that could curdle milk, "Let's be real. Lauren's the real success here." The air shifted. The laughter at the table faltered into that awkward hush people get when someone brings a loaded gun to a picnic. I could feel every muscle in my jaw tighten, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He'd done this before, at my graduation, at my first job dinner, at the time I bought my first car. It was always the same performance. He couldn't stand the spotlight landing anywhere but on his favorite daughter. But this time, the universe had a sense of humor. Mark didn't even look at me before he replied. He looked straight at my dad and said, in that even, almost sympathetic tone he used when cutting budgets, "That's funny. I fired Lauren this afternoon." The sparkler fizzled out right then. A little trail of smoke curled up between us as the silence spread. My dad blinked as if the air had punched him in the face. My mom reached for her bracelet, the same gold one she swore she lost last month. Lauren stared at her water glass like she was trying to drown in it quietly. I just smiled, the kind of smile that barely counts as one, and said, "Well, cheers to new beginnings, right?" The laughter that followed wasn't real, but it was loud enough to fill the space. People needed somewhere to put their discomfort, and noise was the easiest place. Mark took a calm sip of wine. My dad cleared his throat, muttering something about misunderstandings and timing, as if that would erase the fact that his prized daughter had just been dethroned in front of 15 people and a very good tiramisu. The dinner dragged on, but no one remembered the steak or the speech I gave or the promotion itself. They only remembered that moment. The moment the pedestal cracked. Lauren excused herself halfway through dessert. She said she had a headache, which was code for "I can't stand not being the center of gravity." Mom followed her with a tissue and a long-suffering sigh. Dad stayed seated, swirling his drink like it held the answers to all his bad decisions. I stayed too, because for once I didn't want to leave the scene of the crime before the body got cold. When the check came, my dad reached for it automatically, out of habit more than generosity. But Mark put his card down first, looked at me, and said, "You earned this. The company's paying." My dad's hand froze midair like he'd touched a live wire. The man hated nothing more than someone else playing hero in his story. On the ride home, the night air smelled like burnt sugar and champagne. My phone buzzed with texts from colleagues, some congratulatory, some gossiping. Then, right between them, one unknown number popped up. "You weren't supposed to hear that tonight." No name. Just that. I stared at it for a long minute, the way you stare at a mirror when you're not sure what version of yourself is going to look back. When I got home, Mom was already in the kitchen pretending to wash dishes that didn't need washing. She asked if I'd be kind to Lauren. I almost laughed. Kindness had been the family's currency, and somehow I was always overpaying. Lauren's car was in the driveway, but the house was dark. That told me everything I needed to know. She was spiraling in her room, probably calling Dad for damage control. They'd rewrite the story by morning, they always did. I'd be the cold, career-obsessed one who didn't understand family loyalty. It was the same script, recycled with better lighting. But that night, I didn't feel small. For once, I felt awake. Because something in Dad's reaction, something tight and frightened behind his blank expression, told me this wasn't just about pride. He wasn't shocked that Lauren lost her job. He was terrified of what it might expose. And if I'd learned anything working with corporate sharks, it was this: fear never appears without a ledger. Someone always owes someone something. So I poured myself a glass of cheap wine, sat on the couch, and scrolled through Lauren's social media. A week ago, she'd posted a photo in front of her office with a caption, "Big things coming. So proud to be part of the family legacy." The comments were all hearts and prayers, and so well-deserved. I almost pitied her, the way people pitied lottery winners who lost it all by Christmas. But pity was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. That message on my phone wasn't random. Someone wanted to warn me or scare me. Either way, they'd made a mistake by assuming I'd back off. I'd spent years being the quiet, obedient one, smoothing over the messes no one wanted to talk about. But not this time. This time, I wanted to know what exactly my family had been protecting all these years. And when I found out, I planned to toast to it, publicly, with the same kind of smile my father had perfected right before I took back everything they thought I'd never question. By morning, the promotion flowers in my kitchen smelled like a perfume counter after a tornado, and while the coffee dripped like it was being paid by the hour, I opened my laptop with the kind of patient malice I usually reserve for budget season. Because if last night cracked the pedestal, then today I intended to follow the fracture lines until they showed me where the weight really sat, and I knew exactly where to start. The shared drive Lauren used to collaborate, a word she loved because it sounded generous even when it meant other people did the work and she took the picture. I logged into the project archive that housed the launch she'd been bragging about for months, the one with the glossy carousel of photos and the caption about family legacy, and I watched the access graph unfold like a hospital monitor. Pulses of activity spiking after midnight on days Lauren was supposedly out doing stakeholder dinners, which I translated as posting boomerangs of cocktails while an unpaid intern cleaned up her inbox. The audit trail was a quiet little opera. And if you know what to listen for, it starts singing names you weren't expecting, because there, threaded through the late-night edits, was my own credential key, used remotely, used repeatedly, and used to approve vendor invoices I never saw. Which meant someone had borrowed my badge without the courtesy of asking, and had borrowed my reputation along with it. The vendor name tickled something I couldn't place until I remembered a Saturday barbecue at my parents' place when Dad introduced me to Ron from the club, with a wink about guys who get things done, and there it was in black and white like a polite confession. Ron's company rubber-stamping overpriced consulting summaries that read like fortune cookies, coupled with a retainer set just high enough to buy an extra round after 9 holes, which would have been garden variety corporate nonsense if not for the fact that those approvals appeared under my digital fingerprints. I felt the kind of cold that doesn't care about sweaters while I scrolled, because dirty paperwork rarely travels alone. And sure enough, I found a cluster of calendar invites titled Sync, which meant nothing to anyone who hadn't learned to translate office euphemism, and in the metadata of those invites sat a private Gmail tied to Lauren, a forwarding rule to Dad's account, and an auto-delete flag that would have worked beautifully if no one had ever gotten promoted for building the very compliance system that caught it. I sent 3 emails that were as warm as a bank vault, one to IT to lock my credentials, one to finance to freeze all pending vendor payouts on the project, and one to the junior analyst who had spent entire weekends building the dashboard that Lauren presented as if she'd coded it with her eyelashes. In the 3rd email, I attached the updated commission form with the analyst's name at the top, added a short note about rectifying an oversight, and CC'd the public team channel, because there is a special kind of justice in watching applause migrate to the person who earned it while the room realizes the crown was rented. Within minutes, the analyst replied with a stunned thank you that made my throat feel tight and angry in the same breath. Which is how I knew I was doing the right thing, even if the fallout at home would be biblical. By noon, my phone began to hum like a cheap motel sign, first with Lauren's "Can we talk?" that read like a subpoena dressed as a hug, then with Mom's "Careful, please don't overreact, everything is delicate," and finally with the family group chat. A museum of selective memory that had been silent since the night before, and now erupted with Dad's lecture about loyalty, legacy, and not hanging family out to dry over office politics, followed by the command I had been daring him to write ever since I learned to sign my own permission slips: fix Lauren's situation with your boss by Monday, because family looks after family, and he even added a thumbs-up reaction to his own message like a teacher grading his announcement, which would have been funny if it weren't so on brand. I typed and erased a dozen replies, because part of me wanted to send screenshots and part of me wanted to send a single period, but I settled for something that tasted like steel on my tongue. I will not discuss company matters in this chat. And I will not use my role to rewrite consequences, and if anyone accessed my credentials without permission, I suggest they prepare to explain it to people who own more suits than feelings. And then I muted the thread because the next pings were predictable, mom asking for tone, Lauren playing the victim with such dedication she should invoice herself, dad pivoting to guilt about everything we sacrificed for you, which I translated to everything we redirected without telling you. A line I could not yet prove, but could smell the way you smell ozone before a storm. Work did what work does when drama tries to colonize it. It stayed indifferent, which is why I love it. So I spent the afternoon in meetings where numbers don't care your father plays golf with. And during a break, Mark stepped into my doorway with the calm of a surgeon and asked if I was all right, and I told him I would be, and he nodded toward the open laptop and said he appreciated the commission correction and the vendor freeze, and that he had looped legal in because dots were connecting themselves in ways that usually end with stern letters, and I said, very evenly, that if anyone asked whether I wanted to file a personal complaint about credential misuse, I would consider it, and he said, equally evenly, that he understood families and did not envy weekends. On the drive home, the sky looked like someone had dragged a wet brush across it, and as I hit a red light near the grocery store, my phone vibrated with the unknown number again, this time with a longer line that felt like a fingertip on the back of my neck. If you keep pushing, he's going to tell you about the envelope, which sat me up so fast I nearly honked at nobody, because I suddenly remembered the tan envelope with my name on it that lived in the glove box of Dad's car, a relic from a decade ago that I never opened because young me thought trust was the same as manners. The light turned green, the car behind me didn't honk, and I drove the rest of the way home with the realization that my revenge today, publicly rerouting credit to the person who deserved it and cutting off the money spigot to Dad's friend, was only the first turn of the key, because Monday would come whether I obeyed or not, and the envelope waited whether I asked or not. And some debts do not expire just because a family decides to call them love. The weekend arrived with a kind of oppressive heat that made the air feel heavier. And when my parents called me into the living room, I knew from the way Dad's hands gripped the armrests that this was not going to be a conversation about congratulations or casual family chatter. It was a request wrapped in expectation. A demand dressed in the language of concern, because while I had been celebrating a promotion that recognized my work, they were preparing to extract from me the unpaid labor of covering Lauren's financial missteps, and I recognized the pattern immediately, the same one they had perfected over decades, where I was expected to fill gaps, smooth over mistakes, and act as if the invisible costs they placed on me were part of the natural order. They told me about the loan, how Lauren's house, which I had never seen, had fallen behind on payments. A temporary shortfall that somehow became my responsibility to remediate despite the fact that I had only ever contributed my own effort and nothing more. The foreclosure notices, they said, were arriving at the office of the mortgage broker. The language as clinical as it was threatening, and they framed it as a familial problem to be solved quietly, one that could embarrass the family if it leaked. And in that moment I realized that the promotion I had fought so hard for, the salary increase I had earned, and the recognition of my own competence were all invisible when weighed against the myth of Lauren's success. The narrative that Dad had built carefully with borrowed funds, unaccountable favors, and public applause that he now sought to leverage again, but this time against me, assuming I would comply out of loyalty or guilt. I asked questions, not in anger but with measured curiosity, about the exact nature of the loan, the terms of the co-signature, and the timing of the payments. And as I listened to their fumbling explanations, it became clear that Mom had liquidated jewelry, heirlooms that had never belonged to Lauren, in order to cover what Dad claimed was a temporary gap, and she had done so quietly, like a quiet soldier in a war of appearances, while Dad, ever the self-appointed general, positioned himself as the strategist whose orders were unquestionable. And I realized that for years, this was the pattern, Mom bearing the silent cost of their choices, Dad orchestrating the narrative, and me cleaning up the consequence when the numbers didn't align with the mythology. I thought of the envelope, the one from my college years that I had never opened, the one tucked in the glove box that would eventually reveal the scale of the diversion of funds that should have been mine, and I understood that this weekend was a rehearsal. A subtle attempt to see if I would continue to participate in the myth-making without question, and I made a mental plan that would take patience, leverage, and timing, because confronting them directly would have been too obvious, too easily dismissed as overreaction, whereas quiet, deliberate action could rewrite the story in ways they could not anticipate until it was already done. I spent hours tracing bank statements, scanning emails, and cross-referencing payments with project timelines, and every discrepancy I found was a thread leading back to Dad's orchestration. From the timing of Lauren's initial loan to the interest adjustments hidden in fine print, to the partial contributions Mom had made without discussion, and I realized that the house itself, the visible emblem of success, was less a real asset than a symbol, one that required constant intervention from people who were willing to give, lend, and sacrifice in order to maintain the illusion, and I understood that if I intervened correctly, I could reclaim not just the financial leverage, but the moral high ground. By restoring what was owed in a way that could not be refuted without exposing decades of carefully hidden favoritism. I purchased the pawn ticket for Mom's jewelry, the small gold bracelets she had risked quietly to cover Lauren's backstop, and returned them to her with a neatly typed repayment plan addressed to Dad, clearly stating that any future borrowing or interference would require explicit consent, with interest waived only if respect and acknowledgement became non-negotiable. And as I watched her clasp the bracelets around her wrist, I saw relief mixed with apprehension, because she understood that this was not about the objects themselves, but about boundaries finally being enforced, a lesson Dad had ignored and that Lauren had never needed to learn. Later that evening, as I prepared for the week ahead, I received a bank notice tied to my Social Security number, an inquiry for a loan I had never requested, and I recognized the subtle escalation for what it was, a test, an attempt to measure my reaction and my limits, but I had already set my parameters and the path I would follow, and I realized with a quiet satisfaction that the first step of my strategy had succeeded in exposing the mechanics of the favor system, redistributing the credit and the risk, and establishing that my promotion, my agency, and my boundaries would no longer be negotiable, and that every future move they made would be met not with obedience, but with measured, deliberate action that respected neither their myths nor their expectations, but only the ledger of truth that I now held firmly in my hands. The evening was meticulously planned, with an almost ceremonial air that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface, and when I arrived at the restaurant I had chosen for its discreet private dining room, I could already feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on my shoulders, a pressure that was both uncomfortable and necessary, because tonight was not about celebration or reconciliation, but about clarity, accountability, and the careful unspooling of a narrative that had been manipulated for far too long, and I knew that every word I spoke, every gesture I made, would carry consequences that extended far beyond the polished mahogany table and the softly flickering candlelight. Mark, my boss, arrived shortly after me, his presence calm yet commanding, a reminder that authority could be exercised without spectacle, and HR had agreed to join at my request, which ensured that the conversation could not be dismissed as familial drama or personal grievance, and the arrangement of the table, the seating, and the placement of documents was deliberate, a choreography designed to maintain control over what could easily devolve into chaos, because I had learned through long experience that appearances are half the battle, and that those who underestimate the quiet meticulousness of a person who has spent years observing their family's manipulations do so at their own peril. I began by presenting the facts, the careful accumulation of evidence regarding the shared files, the off-book communications, the vendor interactions, and the unauthorized use of my credentials, and I watched Dad's expression as he absorbed each detail. The subtle twitch of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, a map of realization unfolding as I described timelines, financial overlaps, and procedural deviations that had previously been cloaked in the comforting language of family loyalty. And I observed Lauren shifting uneasily in her seat, clearly calculating how to spin or deflect, and I could sense Mom bracing herself, caught between loyalty, fear, and the understanding that the quiet ledger of truth had finally been placed before all of us in a format that could not be disputed. Mark spoke carefully, emphasizing compliance and the potential for legal exposure, but he did so with a tone that was measured and neutral, allowing the facts themselves to carry the weight rather than his judgment. And I appreciated this approach because it ensured that the focus remained on the evidence and not on theatrics, which was exactly the arena in which I needed to operate, and as he outlined the options for resolution, I could feel the strategic advantage shifting subtly in my favor. Because the leverage I had been accumulating through months of observation, documentation, and careful intervention now allowed me to propose a resolution that protected both the company and myself, while gently but irrevocably undermining the myth of Lauren's invulnerability. I laid out the plan for a controlled exit, one that allowed Lauren to maintain a semblance of dignity while addressing the financial and procedural irregularities that had plagued her project. And I framed the proposal as a face-saving measure that would also close the loopholes Dad had long relied upon to manipulate outcomes, and as I watched him react, the color draining slightly from his face, I understood that for the first time in years he was confronted with the reality that his influence had limits and that the careful balance of appearances he had maintained with such precision was now subject to scrutiny and consequence that he could not control through charm or coercion. The envelope from the glove box, which I had carried discreetly in my bag, sat on the table between us like a silent witness, and when I finally slid it across to Dad, the weight of its presence conveyed more than any speech could. Containing the documentation of decades of diversion, misappropriation, and unspoken favors that had been orchestrated under the guise of family loyalty, and I observed the subtle tremor in his hand as he lifted it, recognizing that the leverage was no longer theoretical but tangible, and that every decision he had made in the past, every calculation predicated on my silence, was now part of a ledger I could use to enforce boundaries, reclaim agency, and rewrite the rules that had been dictated to me for too long. Lauren, sensing the shift, tried to speak, but I interrupted gently, noting that the company's compliance framework would guide the resolution, not familial argument. And I could see the panic behind her carefully maintained composure as she realized that the usual channels of parental advocacy, charm, and influence were now ineffective, and that the structural, procedural, and factual reality of her position could not be rewritten by anyone other than those in authority, which in this room meant me and the company representatives who had observed every step of the evidence chain. The evening concluded with a careful balance of civility and silent assertion, leaving Dad stunned, Mom contemplative, and Lauren reevaluating the foundation upon which she had built her narrative of success. And as I left the restaurant, I felt the first real sense of control I had experienced in years, knowing that the leverage of truth, carefully documented, strategically deployed, and supported by institutional authority, had shifted the dynamic irreversibly, and that the final act, when it came, would reveal not only the consequences of misused influence, but also the clarity, calm, and satisfaction of having enforced accountability in a system that had long depended on illusion. The morning light fell through the blinds in long, thin strips that cut across the kitchen floor, casting the familiar pattern that I had grown up associating with quiet revelations and hidden truths, and as I opened the tan envelope from the glove box, the weight of decades pressed against my chest, because within those carefully folded pages lay the proof of a long-standing manipulation, the diversion of my college fund to float Lauren's earliest ventures, the meticulous accounting of transfers, co-signatures, and silent approvals that had never been disclosed to me. And I realized with a mixture of anger and satisfaction that for years I had been carrying the cost of someone else's perceived entitlement, while the family had framed every conversation about fairness as a matter of love and protection, an irony that now felt almost cruel in its precision. Mom had known. That much became apparent as I traced the faint pencil annotations on the margin, the small notes she had left for herself to reconcile payments and donations. The only acknowledgement that she had understood the full extent of Dad's orchestration yet chose silence, and I understood that this silence was not complicity born of malice, but of survival, a pattern that had kept the family image intact while leaving me, the overlooked and diligent child, to internalize the deficit as a personal shortcoming rather than a structural injustice, and I felt a sharp clarity in seeing the ledger of truth, a clarity that was both liberating and disorienting, because the decisions I would make now could not be reversed, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the confines of my own life. I spent hours reviewing the documents, cross-referencing bank statements, checking the dates of transfers against my tuition bills, the scholarship notifications I had been denied, and the invoices that had been quietly settled by funds diverted in my name, and as each layer of detail unfolded, the narrative of my family's manipulation became a pattern, a repeated method of elevating Lauren through borrowed resources and curated appearances while discouraging inquiry and rewarding compliance. And I recognized that the promotion I had fought for and earned, the recognition that had once been undervalued, now gave me the tools to enforce accountability, establish boundaries, and reclaim both the financial and moral high ground without the need for spectacle or vengeance. The first act of reclamation was deliberate. I used my promotion bonus to acquire the building where Dad's longtime business associate, the same man tied to Lauren's initial vendor arrangements, rented office space. A move that simultaneously secured tenants, stabilized income for the company, and subtly redistributed power in a way that neither Dad nor Lauren could manipulate. And I crafted a precisely schedule that froze rent increases for every tenant except the shell company that had funneled consulting funds to Lauren's projects, ensuring that every future attempt to exploit the system would be immediately visible and subject to institutional review. And I watched from my home office as the first automated alerts went out, knowing that control, once established quietly and meticulously, was more powerful than confrontation. I returned Mom's bracelets, the same ones she had pawned to cover temporary gaps in Lauren's finances, and accompanied them with a neatly typed repayment schedule addressed to Dad, offering forgiveness and leniency contingent upon acknowledgement of prior interference and the establishment of explicit boundaries, and I observed her reaction, a mixture of relief and apprehension, because she understood that the gesture was less about material restoration than about asserting limits that Dad had repeatedly ignored, and that the legacy of favoring one child over another could no longer be hidden under the guise of family loyalty without accountability. The final step involved quiet reflection and strategic patience, because the envelope, the documents, and the actions I had taken established leverage that was now latent, a power that did not require display but existed as a constant, immovable presence, a reminder that influence could be checked and myths could be dismantled without public spectacle, and I realized that revenge, when executed with precision and evidence, could be as subtle as it was effective, striking at the foundations of entitlement and control while preserving dignity and reinforcing personal agency, a satisfaction that no emotional outburst or dramatic confrontation could ever provide. Late that evening, Dad called, his voice low and careful, tinged with an unfamiliar urgency, asking to speak about a mistake bigger than the money, and I listened, allowing the pause between words to stretch, knowing that every hesitation revealed a measure of the power shift, and as I considered my response, I understood that the family dynamics, the unspoken debts, and the long-standing assumptions about obedience and loyalty had all been recalibrated by the simple act of unveiling the truth. Deploying it strategically and refusing to engage in the cycles of manipulation that had defined decades, and in that silence, I found a quiet triumph that resonated far beyond the confines of the conversation, leaving the echo of consequence hanging in the air, unanswered and unresolved, as a reminder that control, once reclaimed, does not need to be flaunted, and that the final chapter of influence belongs not to those who shout the loudest, but to those who wield the facts with patience, clarity, and unwavering resolve.